On a calm morning in Burkina Faso, the surface of a vast reservoir sparkles under the rising sun. Yet what floats on these waters is not the usual sight of fishing boats. Instead, there are floating cages, each one filled with hundreds of young tilapia darting beneath the surface. This is not a scene from Norway or Southeast Asia. It is the heart of West Africa, where President Ibrahim Traoré has launched a bold initiative called the Offensive Agropastorale et Halieutique. His goal is clear: to reduce hunger, strengthen food security, and break his nation's dependence on costly imports. Burkina Faso is a landlocked country of more than 20 million people. With no coastline, it relies heavily on imports of frozen fish to meet its people's protein needs. Families in rural villages often go months without access to affordable fresh fish, while malnutrition rates among children remain alarmingly high. For decades, this dependence has been both a weakness and a burden, leaving the country vulnerable to fluctuating prices and political pressures from abroad. President Traoré has decided that the solution will not come from foreign aid, but from the waters of his own land. By installing floating cages on reservoirs and dams across the country, he believes Burkina Faso can provide fish protein to millions of citizens, create jobs, and reclaim sovereignty over its food supply. To many, this vision feels both daring and necessary. Imagine a mother in a village near Dam who has always fed her children millet and sorghum. For the first time, she can buy fresh tilapia raised just a few miles from her home. Imagine a soldier stationed at a remote outpost who no longer relies on imported rations, but can eat fish supplied by local farmers. These are small victories, yet together they could reshape the future of a nation. Still, the question remains: is this a realistic plan that will strengthen Burkina Faso's independence? Or is it another fragile dream that may collapse under the weight of hidden risks? If you believe that food security is the foundation of true freedom, stay with us as we uncover the story behind Burkina Faso's bold fish farming gamble. The official launch of Burkina Faso's fish farming initiative took place not in a boardroom, but beside the waters of Dam, one of the largest reservoirs in the country. Here, under the watchful eyes of local farmers, military officers, and ministers, floating cages were lowered into the lake. Each cage was carefully designed to hold thousands of young tilapia and catfish, species chosen for their adaptability to West African waters. For President Ibrahim Traoré, this moment was more than a technical exercise. It was a declaration that Burkina Faso could take control of its food destiny. The decision to expand pisciculture came after years of vulnerability. Burkina Faso spends tens of millions of dollars each year importing frozen fish, primarily from coastal countries and international suppliers. For a landlocked nation with no direct access to the sea, this dependence is both costly and precarious. At the same time, malnutrition has remained a pressing challenge. According to UNICEF data, more than 1 in 4 children in Burkina Faso suffer from chronic malnutrition. For families in rural areas, protein is scarce, and fish that might be affordable in coastal nations is a luxury inland. Floating cage farming offered a new path. Instead of draining scarce public funds on imports, the government would invest in local production. The plan involves installing hundreds of cages across strategic reservoirs and dams. These cages are relatively simple structures: steel or bamboo frames fitted with nets that hang into the water. Fingerlings are introduced, fed with specially formulated feed, and harvested once they reach market size. With proper management, a single cage can produce tons of fish each year. For ordinary citizens, the benefits could be profound. Take the case of Issa, a young man from a village near Bagre Dam. For most of his life, he worked as a seasonal laborer, earning barely enough to support his family. With the arrival of the fish farming program, Issa was trained to maintain the cages and oversee feeding schedules. In just a few months, he began to see the promise of steady income. For the first time, he explained to a local journalist, "I feel that I am working for my children's future, not just surviving day by day." Beyond individual stories, the government hopes to achieve national impact. Traoré's administration estimates that within 5 years, fish farming could supply a significant share of the country's domestic consumption, cutting imports by half. If successful, this would save millions of dollars annually, create thousands of jobs, and provide affordable protein to families who desperately need it. The symbolism of the project is equally important. Just as Traoré has spoken of energy sovereignty in the fight to free Burkina Faso from dependency on imported fuel, he now frames food security as another battlefield. In his speeches, he draws a direct link between hunger and sovereignty. A nation that cannot feed itself is a nation that is not truly free, he declared. The floating cages on Bagre Dam are therefore more than fish farms. They are political statements, reminders that even small steps toward independence can carry great meaning. Yet despite the enthusiasm, experts caution that pisciculture is not without risks. Feed must be imported or produced at scale, and costs can rise quickly. Diseases can spread rapidly among dense populations of fish if water quality is not carefully maintained. Without proper training, cages can collapse or be neglected, leading to losses that devastate small farmers. Environmentalists warn that large-scale cage farming can pollute reservoirs if waste is not managed. The government insists it has considered these challenges, but skepticism lingers. For now, the people of Burkina Faso watch and wait. The cages float quietly on the reservoirs, a symbol of both hope and uncertainty. For mothers, farmers, and soldiers, the promise is clear: more food, more independence, and more dignity. But for skeptics, the warning is equally stark. If the program falters, the costs could be devastating. Will these floating cages become the foundation of Burkina Faso's food sovereignty? Or will they sink under the weight of hidden dangers? The first harvest came sooner than expected. On a warm afternoon at Bagre Dam, dozens of villagers gathered along the shore as workers hauled in the nets. The surface of the water churned with silver flashes of tilapia, each one a living symbol of possibility. Children laughed as fish spilled into crates, while women clapped and sang traditional songs of gratitude. For the community, it felt like more than a harvest. It was proof that the president's promise might become reality. In Ouagadougou, state television broadcast the scene live. The images of fish being lifted from the water played on repeat, accompanied by bold headlines declaring "Burkina Faso feeds itself." For supporters of President Ibrahim Traoré, it was a moment of triumph. After months of doubt and debate, here was visible evidence that pisciculture could deliver results. "This is the future," a farmer said to the cameras. "No more waiting for trucks from the coast. We will feed our children from our own lakes." Across the country, optimism spread. In towns far from Bagre, people began asking when floating cages would come to their reservoirs. Young men signed up for training programs. Women's cooperatives discussed forming groups to process and sell the fish. Teachers told students that this was a chance for Burkina Faso to show the world that it could innovate, even without the advantages of wealthy nations. For a moment, hope replaced despair. But as excitement grew, so did the voices of caution. Economists on local radio warned that scaling up would not be easy. Feed remained expensive, and much of it was still imported. The cages required constant monitoring, and trained personnel were scarce. If disease broke out among the fish, entire harvests could be lost overnight. It is not enough to show fish in one dam, one expert argued. The question is whether the system can be sustained year after year, across the whole country. Opposition leaders seized on these doubts. They accused the government of staging the harvest as political theater, pointing to Maxwell Chikumbutso's failed promises in the energy sector as a warning of misplaced trust in grand experiments. Today it is fish. Tomorrow it may be another illusion, one critic told a crowd in Ouagadougou. We must not risk the future of our children on dreams that may not hold. Their speeches were sharp, and they resonated with those who had seen development projects collapse before. Even within the military, reactions were divided. Some officers praised the initiative as strategic, strengthening the country's ability to supply its soldiers with protein. They argued that a nation that could feed its army was stronger than one dependent on foreign shipments. Others, however, feared that international donors might cut support if the program was seen as unrealistic or mismanaged. Tensions simmered beneath the surface as the success or failure of fish farming became more than an agricultural issue. It became a symbol of national pride and political survival. At the international level, the reactions were equally mixed. Development agencies applauded Burkina Faso for taking a creative approach to food security. They saw in pisciculture a model that other landlocked countries in the Sahel could adopt. But some foreign fish suppliers worried about losing markets and quietly criticized the program as unsustainable. Floating cages may look promising today, one European importer told a journalist, but in 2 years, many of them will be abandoned. Back at Bagre Dam, Issa, the young man who had been trained to manage the cages, stood proudly beside the harvest. For the first time in my life, he said, I feel that we are not waiting for others to feed us. We are feeding ourselves. His words captured the spirit of the moment, yet even he admitted privately that challenges remained. He worried about the cost of feed, about the health of the fish, and about whether the government could keep its promises once the spotlight moved elsewhere. The scene was both inspiring and unsettling. On the surface, fish glistened in the sun, a sign of progress. But beneath the waters, unseen risks lurked. Diseases, costs, and political battles could all conspire to undo what had just been achieved. The nation stood at a crossroads, lifted by hope but shadowed by doubt. Would these first cages mark the dawn of a new era of food sovereignty? Or were they the fragile beginning of a gamble too great to sustain? In the weeks following the first harvest, fish from the floating cages began to reach markets across Burkina Faso. For many families, the change was immediate and tangible. In villages where protein had long been scarce, mothers could finally afford fresh tilapia to cook alongside millet and vegetables. Children who once survived on thin porridge now had a more balanced diet. Nutritionists in Ouagadougou noted that even small increases in protein consumption could reduce child malnutrition, which still affected more than 1 in 4 children nationwide. For ordinary citizens, the arrival of fish was more than food. It was a taste of dignity, a sign that their nation was taking control of its future. Yet while families celebrated, tensions brewed beneath the surface. Prices initially dropped as new supplies entered the market, but some traders complained that government distribution was uneven. In certain towns, fish remained scarce, while in others it flooded the stalls. Critics accused the administration of using distribution to reward loyal regions while neglecting others. "It is not enough to produce fish," one opposition figure declared. "We must ensure fairness, or else the people will see through the promises." Politically, the stakes were high. President Ibrahim Traoré had staked much of his legitimacy on the idea of sovereignty, both in energy and now in food. Supporters hailed him as a visionary who dared to break with dependency. They pointed to the floating cages as proof that Burkina Faso could innovate without waiting for foreign powers. But opponents warned that the program risked becoming another symbol of overreach. They argued that the government was rushing into expansion without addressing key risks: the high cost of feed, the need for skilled technicians, and the dangers of fish disease spreading in overcrowded cages. If these problems escalated, they warned, the public's hope could quickly turn into anger. The military, a central force in Burkinabe politics, also watched closely. Some officers praised pisciculture as a strategic victory. They argued that a nation able to feed its soldiers with domestic resources was stronger and less vulnerable to foreign pressure. For them, fish farming was not just about food, but about national security. Yet other officers were cautious. They worried that if the project collapsed, it could weaken the government's credibility and destabilize the fragile political balance. Within the barracks, debates broke out. Was this initiative a symbol of resilience or a reckless gamble that placed too much at stake? Among citizens, reactions were equally divided. In rural areas near Bagra Dam, families embraced the project. Women's cooperatives began forming to smoke and dry fish for sale in distant markets. Young men saw opportunities for employment, training, and income. But in urban areas, where imported frozen fish had long been available, some merchants feared losing their businesses. "We have relied on imports for decades," one trader said in Ouagadougou. "Now the government wants to replace them with local fish. But what happens if production fails? Who will feed the city then?" Beyond economics, the cultural symbolism of pisciculture began to shape national identity. In speeches, Traoré described the floating cages as more than farming tools. He called them weapons in the battle for sovereignty. "A people who cannot feed themselves cannot call themselves free," he declared to an audience of farmers and students. The words resonated with many, but also deepened the divide with critics who accused him of exploiting symbolism without addressing technical realities. As the debate intensified, so too did the hopes and fears of ordinary people. Mothers prayed that the program would endure so their children could grow strong. Farmers dreamed of steady income, no longer dependent on uncertain rains. Soldiers wondered if their rations would soon include fish from Burkinabe reservoirs rather than foreign shipments. But opposition voices warned that failure would bring humiliation, debt, and greater dependency than before. The stakes had grown far beyond agriculture. Pisciculture had become a test of governance, sovereignty, and national unity. Success could rally the nation behind Traoré and inspire neighbors across the Sahel. Failure could deepen political divisions and erode the fragile trust that kept the country together. As Burkina Faso's floating cages spread across its waters, the nation stands on the edge of possibility and peril. Will fish farming become a pillar of sovereignty, or will it expose cracks that no leader can repair? While the people of Burkina Faso debated the risks and promises of floating cages, the outside world watched with growing interest. For many, this initiative seemed modest compared to grand projects in energy or infrastructure. Yet behind its simplicity lay a powerful message. A landlocked, resource-scarce nation was daring to redefine food security on its own terms. In Washington, analysts at the State Department noted the significance of Traoré's program. For decades, U.S. aid and agricultural programs had emphasized food imports and international supply chains. A shift toward local self-reliance, even through fish farming, raised questions about whether other African nations might follow the same path. For older American observers, especially those who remembered the Green Revolution, the echoes were familiar. Could floating cages on African reservoirs be the first step in a new food revolution that challenged traditional aid models? In Europe, reactions were divided. France, already unsettled by Traoré's defiance in energy and security policy, dismissed the program as symbolic. Commentators in Paris argued that Burkina Faso lacked the technical capacity to sustain large-scale pisciculture. Yet in Brussels, officials in development agencies took a softer tone, noting that aquaculture could help stabilize fragile Sahel nations by reducing food shortages. Ordinary Europeans, facing rising food prices at home, looked at the images of affordable tilapia with curiosity and even a touch of envy. Russia and China, meanwhile, saw opportunity. Moscow praised the project as an example of African nations taking control of their destiny, framing it as part of a broader struggle against Western dominance. Chinese investors, already active in African agriculture, quietly reached out with offers to provide equipment, feed, and financing. For Beijing, floating cages were not just about fish, but about influence, another chance to deepen ties in the Sahel through trade and infrastructure. International institutions also weighed in. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, FAO, applauded the move, highlighting aquaculture as one of the fastest-growing sources of food globally. But the World Bank and IMF raised concerns. They warned that without careful management, the costs of feed and infrastructure could trap Burkina Faso in new debts. The same organizations that once tied nations to loans for energy projects now saw fish cages as another variable in the struggle between sovereignty and dependency. As the world reacts with skepticism, support, and strategic interest, one question remains. Will Burkina Faso's modest floating cages ripple outward to spark a broader revolution in Africa? Or will they be remembered as a fragile experiment drowned by global pressures? As the sun sets over the reservoirs of Burkina Faso, the floating cages stand quietly, swaying with the water. To some, they are little more than steel frames and nets. To others, they are symbols of defiance, hope, and dignity. For the first time in generations, families in a landlocked nation can look at their own waters and see the promise of food. For President Ibrahim Traoré, the cages are not just about fish. They are about sovereignty, the right of a people to feed themselves without waiting for convoys at the border or shipments from abroad. Yet destiny is never uncontested. Experts warn of disease outbreaks, rising feed costs, and the dangers of overstocking reservoirs. Environmentalists caution that if waste from the cages is not managed, the very waters that give life could become polluted. Politicians argue that the program could collapse if mismanaged, leaving the country more vulnerable than before. Every cage that floats is therefore both a promise and a gamble. For ordinary citizens, the meaning is more immediate. A mother cooking tilapia for her children does not think about debt ratios or international trade. She thinks about protein on the plate, strength in her children's bodies, and dignity in providing a meal without charity. A soldier stationed far from the capital does not dwell on global politics. He sees fish in his ration and knows that his country is trying to stand on its own feet. These are the human faces of an experiment that has captured both hope and anxiety. The world is watching. Supporters see a model for Africa, a step toward self-reliance in a region long defined by dependency. Skeptics see a fragile dream, vulnerable to collapse under economic and ecological pressure. The truth is that no one can yet know which vision will prevail. So we return to the central question. Is pisciculture in floating cages Traoré's masterstroke, the key to food sovereignty in the Sahel? Or will it be remembered as another bold gamble that sank under the weight of its own ambition? If this story has made you reflect on what freedom truly means, share your thoughts. Do you believe real independence begins with the power to feed your own people? Because food security is not only Africa's struggle, it is a universal human right. May God bless Burkina Faso, and may every nation find the strength to nourish its future.